you got into even studying methylene, that kind of stuff, and including your degrees.
I'm actually from Canada, I was born in Toronto, and I went to U of T, and then I've known for much of my adolescence I moved to the States, and I thought, well, I should probably join the Army. And so, my father was a draft doctor, so I thought, well, I've got to make up for him. And joined the Army. He recently passed away, actually, and I got a chance to go through all of his paperwork around the time of his coming over to Canada. After he'd been to draft, very, very interesting to talk about that at some point. Anyway, after college, I was accepted to the Army's medical school in the States, Uniformed Services University. So I attended there, and then I figured I would do public health or epidemiology. I saw that movie Outbreak when I was a kid. I want to do what that was the character does. So I went into preventive medicine, and I had my early career was mostly doing data analysis, policy development, and of course at the time, as was the case in Canada at the time, the U.S. military was of the belief that methylene was this wonder drug, and they developed it, of course. And this is what we were talking about. This was a great drug, really the drug of choice for overseas deployment. And my first real experience with methylene was when I was selected for deployment to Afghanistan. So this would have been in the fall of 2006. I got word that I was selected to join the 82nd to go over to Bagram Air Base, where the headquarters was. And I remember, I guess it was right after New Year 2007. I just joined the unit. We were heading over there from the Marine ramp, and they told me, as we were waiting to board the plane to go over to Afghanistan, we all just lined up, we were ready to board the plane, and said, reach into this garbage bag and just take a box of methylene. And I reached in the bag, and it was somebody else's prescription. It was a prescription for methylene that somebody else had made. And I remember asking someone about this. I said, what is going on? I thought we were at least supposed to individually prescribe these drugs. And I was told, yeah, we have a roster of all the drugs in the unit, and we just mass prescribe the drug. They're all the same, so just take it. And at first I didn't think much of it beyond that, but that was just sort of sloppy, right, for record keeping. But then it occurred to me, I'd done some data analysis in the months preceding my deployment. I was just looking incidentally at mental health figures and psychotropic drug use, and I had done some studies that showed at least 10%, if not 20%, in some subgroups of our troops in general had some sort of mental health history. Right? They'd been prescribed an antidepressant or diagnosed with some sort of mental health condition. And at this point, I wasn't really aware of the dangers of methylene that we're all too familiar with today, but I did know at the time, and I think everybody, that you weren't supposed to give the drug to folks with a mental health condition, right? This was very clear. The drug, for whatever reason, it was contraindicated to those with a mental health condition. And it occurred to me that everyone that was reaching into that garbage bag, everybody that was getting on the plane, included 10 to 20% of folks with a mental health history. And I thought, this is not right. These folks are getting methylene. So that was probably the first time that I realized, as someone that had been inside the Washington, D.C. government, that had assumed the Army was doing everything correctly from high on my ivory tower where I had been. When I actually saw how things were working on the ground, I realized maybe this is problematic. And it was only after I'd been in Afghanistan for maybe a few weeks to a few months, and I started hearing the stories from multiple soldiers that I deployed with. They were experiencing problems with the drug, not just folks with mental health histories, but folks up until then had been completely healthy. And that's when I realized we had a problem. That's when I realized we had a problem. And that began my exploration of this issue. I was able to initially publish some studies exploring that fact that I had just commented on, right? That we were using this drug in populations that shouldn't be given the drug. That was my initial foray into the topic. And then in subsequent years, as my name became associated more and more with methylene, and more veterans just this career-long research focus of mine. When I separated in 2012, I went back to Hopkins, where I'd done some public health training, and I focused on Mefloquine for my 4 or 5 years there at Hopkins, and ever since then I've been able to make a modest living serving as an expert witness and doing research and consulting in this area. So I suppose what it's been 15 plus years that I've been pretty much focused on this topic completely accidentally, right? And if you'd asked me when I started my Army career, or if you'd even asked me, that day on the green ramp when I first reached in that garbage bag and grabbed a box of Mefloquine, you'd ask me if this would be my career, I'd probably say no. Yes, it was.
Yeah, so it strikes me some of the parallels, because I was the pharmacy rep for the airborne regiment for the deployment. And the same thing, we just brought in a great big large bottle, showed up one day and said, here, break this down into 3 packs and distribute it. And I remember a couple presentations that you've got over the years. One of the things that you had mentioned was, especially from the Canadian government point of view, was if they did not know, they ought to have known, right? That this was a dangerous drug. And one thing that strikes me is the WHO study that was conducted in 1985, published in 87, 5 years before we deployed to Somalia. It cited 38% neuropsychiatric injury rate. How is it that, Health Canada does have a rule that says if they think it'll be a benefit, they can license it for use. But for the most part, everything requires stage 4 testing. Stage 4 testing has to be done even if it's licensed for use prior to that. So I guess I'm curious from your knowledge perspective, how do we account for this drug being licensed for use without a safety study? Did it have stage 4 testing? And why would they not know about something like 38% injury rate from the previous research?
A lot to unpack there. So no, that's okay. And hopefully I can give you a simple answer. So what was known, or what ought to have been known around the time that Mefloquine was going through its pre-licensing and licensing phase in the 70s and 80s, what should have been known to everyone involved, but seemingly wasn't, was that this drug belonged to a class of medication that for many, many decades was known to have neurotoxic potential. That for whatever reason, in some individuals, maybe not everyone, but in some individuals, at the low dose rates used in prophylaxis, some people would experience signs and symptoms, dizziness, disequilibrium, tinnitus or ringing in the ears, auditory changes, seizures, and psychiatric symptoms, insomnia, nightmares, anxiety, depression, restlessness, even full-fledged psychosis, that some people would experience these symptoms, typically early during dosing. And this effect was not mysterious at all, or shouldn't have been mysterious to anyone, because by this point we understood what was going on with this class of drug. There were some studies going back to the 1940s. In some people, this drug, seemingly, the best explanation is that it was accumulating idiosyncratically in brain tissue, where the drug really doesn't belong for the prevention and treatment of malaria, because the malaria parasite is not in the brain typically, it's in the blood. So there really doesn't need to be any of the drug in the brain. So when we see these symptoms develop from drugs of the class, it's an indication that the drug is accumulating for whatever reason in the brain, and clearly acting in a encephalopathic manner, disrupting the basic physiology of the brain. And those symptoms, those early symptoms, are an indication of personal susceptibility. This was known, or ought to have been known to absolutely everyone involved in the development of Mefloquine. Now, there was never any clear indication of this fact in the early product inserts or in any of the early discussion of this, but I guarantee you, people at Roche and people in the World Health Organization decades through the manufacturing review process, knew about this. Because if you look at the drug label, there's the early drug labels had this very odd warning. It said, if during prophylactic use, signs and symptoms, certain signs and symptoms develop, such as anxiety, depression, restlessness, or confusion, these must, not may or should, these must be considered prodromal to a, quote, more serious event. Now, what could be more serious than anxiety, depression, restlessness, or confusion? Those are already pretty serious, right? Well, this to me is a tell that they understood what those symptoms indicated, that these were prodromal, or an early warning sign, of a fulminant encephalopathy that could manifest with symptoms including psychosis, violent behavior, suicidal ideation, and even a permanent neurotoxicity. And we knew about this.
Now, can you explain what encephalopathy is?
Encephalopathy is any dysfunction of the brain, the central nervous system. So encephalopathy is a generic term to describe, excuse me, essentially a physiological disruption of normal neurophysiology. So a neurotoxic, a toxic chemical that gets into the brain at modest concentrations can be encephalopathic. So, for example, lead from lead gasoline or lead paint causes lead encephalopathy, and the symptoms of lead encephalopathy are known as Quinism. Mercury, the neurotoxin mercury, commonly used among filters back in the day, is where we get the term Mad Hatter's disease from. That causes mercury encephalopathy, which is manifested by a change in personality and so on, where the Mad Hatter's personality is inspired from. And then solvents. If you work in the automobile industry, you may be exposed to solvents, for example, and solvents are common occupational neurotoxins that can lead to solvent encephalopathy, and that has certain neurological psychiatric symptoms. So Mefloquine encephalopathy or quinine encephalopathy, mefloquine is a quinine, is broadly similar, right? There's certain defining signs and symptoms that sort of indicate what the poison is. In this particular case, it's that pattern of nightmares, insomnia, anxiety, accompanied by fairly specific neurological symptoms such as tinnitus and dizziness that indicate that you're suffering encephalopathy from quinine or mefloquine. But the reason this is important is because, of course, this encephalopathy was known about. The package insert even says there's a risk of encephalopathy. And if you go back to the World War II era, we had done all sorts of studies on related quinines, a drug called Adavocacy or Mefloquine, also known as quinacrine, produced very similar effects. And at the time, it was even described by the Army physicians that were writing about the effects of Adavocacy or quinacrine, that the most predictable early warning signs of a developing encephalopathy were, can you guess? Insomnia, vivid dreams, anxiety, depression, restlessness, or confusion. The exact same words in almost the exact same order. Now tell me, is that a coincidence? Or did the people who first manufactured and marketed Mefloquine, were they aware of this liability? Now, I don't have any documents that absolutely prove this, but from a circumstantial perspective, it seems to be very unlikely that the manufacturers, the entire edifice that was responsible for this drug, was completely unaware of this. My thinking is that they knew that this drug had a liability to quinine encephalopathy, that they knew that some people, we don't know why, were susceptible, but there was no way to test them in advance to see if they were susceptible, but that the early development of these prodromal symptoms was the best marker. And this is why the attorneys for Roche and whatever other drug companies incidentally marketed it, excuse me, that's why the attorneys insisted on adding that language. Now, of course, all this revising of the product insert was taking place around the same time that people were realizing that this drug that was initially thought to have no psychiatric liability actually was associated with all these reports of side effects. And early on in this process, it appears to be the case that there was a deliberate decision made to manufacture doubt about the actual causal association of these symptoms. Right? There were a number of preventive medicine docs, malariologists, travel medicine docs that received funding from a variety of sources, including the government that wanted the drug license and Roche that wanted the drug license. A number of people were essentially paid to manufacture doubt about the association of these symptoms with the drug, which is in direct contradiction to what the drug company knew full well, that these symptoms were caused by and predicted these more serious effects. And I've often said that the real problem, that the real error was made around this time when a seeming decision was made on the part of the institution to manufacture doubt about these effects, because what that led to was a complete inability for prescribers and institutions like the militaries to internalize that guidance, right? Had they simply said, look, here's this drug, it's pretty good, it's not without its flaws. In about 2/3 of people, you can give them this drug once a week, super convenient, and they'll never get malaria. Well, they will, but they won't get as much malaria. It's pretty convenient. You can get them all in formation once a week, and you can have them take a pill in front of you, and your unit will be, pretty much protected against malaria. However, this is what they could have said, should have said. However, in maybe 1/3 or maybe even up to a half, they'll develop these warning signs, things like vivid dreams, nightmares, and they'll know the things. Anxiety, depression, restlessness, confusion. And if they develop those symptoms, absolutely, right away, stop them from taking any more because and keep an eye on them. Keep an eye on them for about a week or two. Because those symptoms could be the first warning sign that they have a personal intolerance to the drug, and that this intolerance could progress up to and including frank psychotic and even suicidal or homicidal behavior. The encephalopathy can progress very quickly, so keep an eye on it. And, other than that, slight risk of suicide and homicide and all those other bad effects and permanent neurotoxicity, other than those effects in 1/3 of the people that take the drug, other than that, it's pretty good. If they had just said that, then we could have, I think, avoided a lot of these problems. But of course, had they said that, had they admitted straight away what the real problem was with the drug and not obscured it behind all this manufactured doubt, how many militaries do you think would have actually decided to use the drug, right? It would have been very difficult to operationalize the use of the drug. And I think that's why a decision was made early on to just go for it. Just deny, and just hope that the problems it creates aren't that bad. And as we all know, that didn't work out so well.
Yeah, no, it didn't, because, it's true, because had they, right after Somalia recognized what had taken place, we would have been pensioned, and this would have been done over. Yeah, I saw a hand over here.
Just a question. Dr. Nevin, what's going on with Sergeant Bales currently? Any update on his legal action?
No. Well, so the Bales case is interesting. I was interviewed extensively for the podcast that was just aired. I'm not sure how. Can I get a show of hands? I'm just curious. Who listened to the Robert Bales story podcast that was recently released on iHeartRadio podcast? Anyone? No. So it's worth a listen. Look it up. The Robert Bales story by iHeartRadio podcast. So I was contacted by the Robert Bales team. I guess it was 2017, so 5 or 6 years ago. And there's been a lot of development since then, including some fairly credible evidence that he might not have actually acted alone initially. But that's neither here nor there to the central argument that his defense team has been making, namely that just for some context, there's universal agreement that in the hours before he and possibly someone else engaged in the massacre, there's universal agreement. There's no disputing this, that he reported on multiple occasions seeing flashing lights being exchanged between the two villages that he would later attack. And he expressed on numerous occasions that these flashing lights were an indication of imminent attack, and that as a result of this imminent attack signaled by these flashing lights, something needed to be done about these people. So there's no doubt at all about that. And I argue that sort of thinking, that sort of thought process is decidedly abnormal. That is borderline psychotic. That because it doesn't make any sense, right? If everyone had cell phones there, they could easily walk between villages. There's no reason for even if his central premise was true, that there were Taliban sympathizers in both villages that were planning an imminent attack on the base. Let's just take that for a given, because that's actually quite plausible. Why on earth would they have signaled their intent to do that with flashing lights? It doesn't make any sense. And so I've argued that his interpretation of those flashing lights was an indication of an underlying psychotic, paranoid thought process. And that the flashing lights themselves, he might not have actually seen them. That might have been a visual hallucination, because he first noticed them when he was on guard duty. And the fellow he was with very clearly said, "I don't see anything." So I have argued that Bales was under some sort of low-level psychotic process at the time, and that's fundamentally what drove him to do what he was doing. So we could certainly debate, whether if everything he had seen and believed was true, whether he would have been justified doing what he did. I think the conclusion would be no, he shouldn't have done that. But it explains his motivation, I think. And so the question is, where did this sort of paranoid, persecutory delusion that he was under come from? And I've argued that this is most consistent with a Mefloquine effect, either something acute from use of the drug around that time. Perhaps he was taking Mefloquine at that time in Afghanistan. But even if he wasn't taking any drug at the time, he had taken Mefloquine in 2003 to 2004. There's good evidence, good eyewitness evidence that the unit he was with, the formation he was in, was subject to directly observed therapy. Every week they would take Mefloquine. And there's no reason to think that Bales was somehow excluded from the process, because the evidence we have is that he was in those formations with at least one person that attests under oath to having seen Mefloquine distributed in this manner. So I'm assuming that Bales did take Mefloquine in 2003 to 2004. And he does report reliably, I think, a history of hallucinations during his use of the drug. He reported seeing, for example, purple dudes running across a bridge one night, which is a pretty specific indication of Mefloquine encephalopathy. And his wife, Carrie, reports him being very paranoid, having this sort of extremely odd behavior, securing the house, doing patrols around the house, waking up in the middle of the night, searching for bad guys around his house when he got home. That's a little more than PTSD. That's a Mefloquine level paranoia. So I'm under the assumption that at the time of his deployment to Afghanistan in 2012, when he and possibly one other person committed the massacre, he was laboring under at least some low-level Mefloquine psychosis, either acutely or chronically. And if that's the case, if there is some psychotic element that could be attributed to Mefloquine, then he was not given a fair trial, because that mental health aspect of his case was not fully explored by his attorney. And had a credible mental health defense been possible, had it been possible to find a medical expert, for example, at the time to argue this, I think you can reasonably argue he wouldn't have accepted the plea bargain, he wouldn't have taken a guilty plea, and then possibly he might have even been found criminally insane as a result, because the U.S. Army in particular has a very low bar to a mens rea not being present in the presence of even slight psychotic behavior. So I recognize when I work with the Bales case, it alienates a lot of veterans, because of course many people say, well, I took enough of them and I didn't shoot up 2 villages. Absolutely fair. But many Mefloquine veterans will concede that they labor with these struggles where they fight not perceiving ill intent and evil and danger in completely benign stimuli. I think many Mefloquine veterans will concede it's a lifelong fight, to stave off that paranoia, stave off those delusions. And so, if you put yourself in his shoes, now Bales he's a unique guy, right? Like he takes matters into his own hands. And so, laboring under these persecutory delusions, Bales has decided, I'm going to take action, even though that's kind of like against the rules. He decided, I'm just going to do it, because that's the kind of guy Bales was. So So I hope ethical directors can appreciate why I think it's important to raise awareness of this aspect of this trial, and hopefully to try to separate, Bales, the convicted war criminal and mass murderer who did terrible things to children and women, from Robert Bales, the all-around mostly decent guy that volunteered for service on September 11, 2001, and who up until that massacre had arguably, carried more than his fair share in the course.
That overlaps a lot of the story which we already know as well. The parallels are not recent there. And you're right, because I had an episode of 5 hours of hallucination in the middle of the night only a month and a half ago, and it scared the crap out of my wife, and I have no memories of it. So that was 30 years ago that I took that from her. So one of the things that I remember you're speaking about is the development of anti-malarials through the Vietnam era. And at the same time, there's a lot of research going on PTSD, which came out of the Vietnam era as well. And co-founders, because of the overlap of PTSD symptoms with something like MEF-TOX-VET. Can you maybe talk on that for a little bit from the research perspective? What's the importance of co-founders and PTSD researchers? Is there any research that details that?
So I think you're referring to confound. Oh, and I should say, perhaps. And I should say, earlier, and I didn't really get to it, you were discussing the different phase studies, the different clinical phases. So let me just briefly address that because you reminded me of that. So Stefan was mentioning the development method, and there were no, I think you said phase 4 trials. So for a drug to be licensed in both Canada and the United States, there should be a final stage of testing called phase 3 testing, which is a test under real world settings of both the safety and efficacy of the drug. Meaning they're not just looking for side effects or adverse effects, but they're also looking to make sure that the drug has the beneficial effect that it's being marketed for. Now, there are many ways of doing clinical studies like that, but typically the best way to do a clinical study so that you can convince yourself and skeptics that the effects and the safety data are valid and don't represent bias or confounding or statistical variation is to do a randomized controlled trial, preferably a blinded trial where you don't know what drug you're getting. Now, the problem, and those tests were not done with Mefloquine, but that is probably in and of itself understandable because Mefloquine was being developed for prevention and treatment of chloroquine-resistant malaria. And the drug companies successfully argued that there wasn't another drug, a comparative drug is the term, that could have been used as the control arm. So ideally a study would have given a Mefloquine to some people and would have given another licensed drug to the control arm. And they would have sent people overseas and they would have seen how many folks in the Mefloquine arm that didn't know they were taking Mefloquine, right, developed malaria, or how many developed side effects, and then how many in the control arm developed malaria or developed side effects. Now, they argued they couldn't do that because there was no other drug. There was no control drug. Now, that's not true. There was drug doxycycline, but that wasn't licensed at the time. So they couldn't have done the studies in what they argued ethical manner for that reason. Neither here nor there, I think, because there certainly was enough evidence for the safety and efficacy of the drug to be properly queried had all parties been honest about what they knew, right? And the point I made in answering your question was that the drug company and the developers of the drug in the military, they, I think, knew far, far more than they revealed to the drug regulators, right? Because had they been explicit and said, look, we know that this drug causes prodromal symptoms, those prodromal symptoms are an early warning sign, this is encephalopathy, then the drug regulators might have said, wait a second, No way. Are you saying a third of people that take this drug overseas in a malaria endemic area are going to need to stop it? What are they going to switch to? Are you going to be prescribing a backup drug every time they go overseas with Mefloquine? That's not going to work. Just give them the backup. So had they been fully honest about the drug, I don't think, even if it was licensed, I think it was very, very cautious. Turns out only the public or large institutional prescribers would accept it. Okay, so that's that. Your new question was about the development of Mefloquine in the 70s and 80s, coinciding with clinical appreciation of what we today call post-traumatic stress disorder, and what we might call something else in 10 years. So as I mentioned many times before, PTSD is a recognized diagnosis in the medical community, in the psychiatric community, and in the context of veterans' disability, going back to World War II, was not recognized as a disorder. There was no recognition that exposure to combat could lead to the development of a purely psychiatric condition marked by vivid remembering of traumatic events and associated with hypervigilance and anxiety and so on. That recognition was only made formally in 1980. It was only made formally in 1980 by the American Psychiatric Association, coincident with the VA acknowledging and starting to award the benefits for it. And in large part, the reason that the American Psychiatric Association and the VA formally acknowledged PTSD is because of the advocacy efforts of a group of Vietnam veterans that would end up being Vietnam veterans in America and so on. And for, I believe, a decade prior, throughout the 70s, they had been telling a very irresponsive psychiatry and VA community that there's something different about us. That those of us who have been in Vietnam, we're coming home and something's not right, and the psychiatrists don't recognize it. This is just, there's more, kind of like what the Gulf War veterans went through, right? People didn't believe them, and that's all in your head. And the veterans at the time do know there's something different about this. And if you actually look at the papers from the time when clinicians are describing the original complaints of Vietnam-era veterans, they're not describing something that aligns perfectly with today's conception of PTSD. You know what they're describing? They're describing a multi-system type of disorder marked by a predominance of neuropsychiatric symptoms, definite neurological abnormalities, similar to what Mefloquine veterans complain of, and then psychiatric abnormalities which are much more heavily weighted towards symptoms like dissociation and psychosis, which is relatively uncommon in today's conception of PTSD. So I have argued, and this is all speculation, but I have argued that, and another point just for a point of context, is that our conception of what PTSD is continues to change. Since 1980, the diagnostic criteria have been revised many times, and I think, even many in the field who've been researching PTSD for many decades will sort of privately admit it's just a big wastebasket diagnosis that even comes back from overseas, and they're having any sort of psychiatric symptoms that don't neatly fit into the established psychiatric nosology, just call it PTSD, because of course they've seen something bad, so everything that develops is obviously the result of trauma. I suppose I'd call it a theory. My theory is that much of the early clinical illness, the clinical burden that led to the VA and the APA formalizing diagnostic criteria for PTSD actually came from veterans who had come back from Vietnam and Korea, who had developed quinoline encephalopathy from our use of combination Remington and chloroquine, which together or individually can cause many of the same types of symptoms as Mefloquine. And just as a thought experiment, just imagine if we'd been giving Mefloquine out in Vietnam, right? And there wasn't any recognition of Mefloquine's side effects, and there wasn't any acknowledgement of PTSD. The psychiatry community probably would have settled on something very similar to PTSD. right? If these veterans, even if there was no PTSD, right? That's my argument. Even if exposure to trauma didn't cause chronic effects, and it does. I'm not disputing that. But let's just suppose that it didn't. That the only way you have chronic nightmares, the only way you have chronic anxiety in a deployment situation is to take Mefloquine. That's it. If we had used Mefloquine in Vietnam, we'd have a whole bunch of soldiers coming back reporting chronic nightmares, anxiety, depression, some mild neurological problems that seem nonspecific. It, to me, seems pretty plausible that we would have still developed a diagnosis called post-traumatic stress disorder and blamed it all on the trauma of war. And so I wonder how much of our current conception of PTSD has been confounded or confused, potentially by early studies that were actually looking at the effects in large part of Mefloquine and Quinism.
Thank you. Yeah. Is there a solution other than doxycycline? Or because my understanding right now is that whatever we're using today, the drug being that it will cause the same problems as well, just maybe on a lesser percentage. Is there a solution without a quinoline-based approach to malaria?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And here's the real tragedy. So the real tragedy is, of course, in Canada, of course, before your government decided to exploit that road safety monitoring so that you get industrial quantities of valerian shipped out here, the Canadian military was routinely using doxycycline as an anti-malarial for overseas deployments. And doxycycline is it's quite good. It's quite a good drug. To give you some context, I do work in public health, local public health department, and it's very common to just put our folks that come into STD clinic on just a permanent course of doxycycline because they're at risk of catching syphilis, chlamydia over and over again, and so on. Just give doxycycline year round. That way they won't get sick and they won't spread it. So long-term use of doxycycline is very, very, very common. Always has been very, very, very common. And it was known to be a perfectly effective antimalarial back in the 80s. And of course, the real cherry on the top here is that of course the U.S. military developed valerian and said they needed it because they weren't happy with doxycycline, so they needed that. And guess what drug we went back to declaring was our first line drug when we pretty much prohibited valerian at the beginning of 2009? Doxycycline, right? So the real tragedy is that we never needed valerian. We never needed. Here's where we go down the rabbit hole. We never needed valerian as an anti-malarial. I don't know why the military developed a drug that makes soldiers reliably anxious and paranoid and slightly homicidal. I have no idea why the military would want to do something and give that drug to soldiers. I have no idea. It's just a big coincidence. But we never needed valerian as an anti-malarial. Now, there is an argument to be made that there was a concern that doxycycline would lose its effectiveness, and so we always wanted to have a backup drug. But there were other backup drugs as well. So the quinoline core, from which I've coined the term quinism or quinoline encephalopathy, I think is just inherently toxic. The problem with Mefloquine-related drugs is the property that makes them effective antimalarials. And it's a little bit complicated to explain. There are many ways you can attack a parasite during its life cycle, because the parasite typically undergoes many different forms. And so there's numerous targets where you can design an effective pharmaceutical. But what the quinoline moiety or targets is the parasite's life stage in the red blood cell, where it's eating the heat, the oxygen carrying molecule in the red blood cell. And it does that by concentrating the heat in a very acidic vacuum, an intracellular bubble that's very, very, very acidic. And it just so happens that Mefloquine, because of its chemical structure, it can freely permeate across membrane. So it bounces around in the parasite, and it just finds its way, and because it freely permeates, it's like a ghost that just goes through the walls. It finds its way into the highly acidic food vacuole of the parasite, and because of the quinoline pore, when it gets there, it gets immediately protonated at protons, which is what an acid is, right? It's a high concentration of free protons. Those protons protonate the quinoline pore and take away its ability to freely permeate. And so the drug concentrates as a result, many hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of times the extracellular concentration. So the end result of the mefloquine being administered in an organism where there are malaria parasites is the drug will concentrate many fold inside the malaria parasite, where it'll exert a toxic effect. The only problem with that is that same effect can be seen with acidic vacuoles in our own cells. So we also have acidic vacuoles in our cells, and in the central nervous system, we also have acidic vacuoles. And we still don't understand fully how mefloquine actually exerts, on a molecular basis, its toxic effect. But it seems likely to me that in individuals who are susceptible to these effects, and again, not everyone seems to be susceptible, but the individuals who are susceptible, I think because it enters their brain and it doesn't get detoxified, that this drug seems to accumulate in some sort of critical area of the neuron or the glia. I'm not exactly sure. And essentially poisons the cell and kills it, essentially. And that's what leads to the sort of focal neurotoxicity that I've described, which has been seen in histopathology. And so the same properties that make mefloquine an effective anti-malarial also make it an effective neurotoxicant. And that's just not a good combination.
Mefloquine 2.0 I'll let you pronounce it. Is that coming to a pharmacy near us? What's coming out of that?
So tafenoquine, funny story. Every 20, 30 years, it seems, the military, they can't help themselves. They develop a new quinoline for whatever reason. So at first it was Adabrine, right, in World War II, and then it was chloroquine after that, and then primaquine, which we still use. And then it was mefloquine, and now it's tafenoquine. So I'm sure they're working on mefloquine 3.0 here. And the rationale typically is that, well, resistance develops, side effect profile is not good, so we have to make a new improved quinoline. With tafenoquine, it's the funniest story. It's so ironic, and you really should laugh. Well, so you almost can't make this up, because there was a civilian scientist, his name was Jeffrey Dow, and this is all public knowledge. I believe he was a civilian scientist, either a contractor on staff, and working with a very famous Army malariologist, Dr. McGill, who was sympathetic to our cause. He was very sympathetic to the plight of mefloquine veterans, although he had to be careful what he said at the time. Legend in the Army malariology community. McGill was very sympathetic. He understood there was something wrong with mefloquine. So he had Dr. Dow, his neurotoxicologist on staff at Rare, do some studies on the neurotoxicity of mefloquine. Sure enough, found mefloquine very neurotoxic, not good. Published a whole bunch of papers under the Walter Reed institutional affiliation, stating, yeah, mefloquine probably not a good anti-malarial because of its neurotoxicity, yada, 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 stuff we all accept today. But at the same time, they were also working on tafenoquine. And it was thought, well, tafenoquine maybe doesn't have the same liability. In the same way that the mefloquine was being developed, they also thought it didn't have any neuropsychiatric liability. So for whatever reason, tafenoquine got put on the shelf for a long time. And while it was being put on the shelf, apparently this intern who was working at Walter Reed decided to continue on some of this neurotoxicity testing that Dow had started earlier on. And so she was looking at tafenoquine and mefloquine and chloroquine, looking at the neurotoxicities of these various drugs, and not surprisingly, noticed that, well, mefloquine is very neurotoxic, and the only drug that she tested that was more neurotoxic than mefloquine was tafenoquine. But nobody cared. She was allowed to publish this. She wasn't, immediately canceled because by this point the Army had given up on tafenoquine. This poster disappeared from view until we found it some years later. But a few years after that, the Army decided, wait a second, actually, let's go ahead and see if we can resurrect Tefenicline. And the Army can't develop drugs themselves. They need to hire, they need to contract with outside entities, outside companies. So the Army couldn't develop Mefloquine on its own. It needed to recruit Roche to commercialize Lariam and get it through the drug licensing. And no regular drug company wanted to touch Tefenicline with a 10-foot pole for obvious reasons. So guess who volunteered to create a new company that would get the rights to Tefenicline and market it? None other than Jeffrey Dow, the same fellow that had published extensively on the neurotoxicity of methadone. So you really can't make this up. So now, of course, if you're going to, and there's nothing wrong with this. I fully support the Army's very generous funding of these one-off drug companies that develop drugs for military use. I think this is an unmet need. Industry's not going to do it. The military can't do it. So in general, I have no problem with this. Where I have a problem is when the system, where the desires of the military lead the FDA to sort of give undue deference to the wishes of the military and maybe turn a blind eye to certain safety problems. As was very obviously the case with methadone. Well, so anyway, not surprisingly, after many, many years, this company, run by the scientists that published extensively on the neurotoxicity of methadone, was able to convince FDA to license the Tefenicline. But this license was granted right before the pandemic. And they were counting, I think, on a large international travel demand for this drug. I think much like Larry, they were hoping that there'd be a large number of international travelers that would prescribe Tefenicline under the trade name Maricoda and others, and then they would make some money that way, their expenses. And then, of course, the recent unpleasantness hit, and there was no international travel. So I don't know how that company's managed to survive. I assume that they've been getting lots of grant money from the military to keep the lights on. And presumably the military's been ordering large stockpiles of Tefenicline and just letting it sit on the shelf and letting it expire, and then they order more. This is normal, this is customary, this is what they do to incentivize the development of new drugs and vaccines for military use. The military routinely places large orders, fills the warehouse with large, stocks of these drugs, ostensibly for emergency purposes, but really just to give a financial lifeline to these companies to pay it back for their good work developing a drug that we might need. Now, the real question is, will we ever operationally use Tefenicline? I don't think the Army is going to touch that drug operationally with a 10-foot pole. I'd be very surprised if it does, because a lot of things have changed, right? The drug company, the Dow runs, insists that there are no real side effects with this drug, that it doesn't have the same neuropsychiatric liability that Mefloquine and every other quinoline has. Even though this drug in particular is called an 8-aminoquinoline. It's a particular type of quinoline. And even though every single 8-aminoquinoline that's ever been subjected to neurohistopathology testing in appropriate animal models has demonstrated unequivocal evidence of permanent brainstem toxicity. And I'm not just talking a handful, I'm talking dozens and dozens of 8-aminoquinolines tested beginning in World War II era. Even though every single 8-aminoquinoline, including primidone, has proven permanent neurotoxic liability, they insist that Tefenicline, for whatever reason, has none. So, if you're a betting person, that might be a bet you want to take, because I think in due course, we're going to learn that this drug has the same liability as every other 8-aminoquinoline, and the same type of neuropsychiatric liability that has marred all of the other quinolines. I think our military knows this. I think that's why they're cautious in using Tefenicline. And of course, we really haven't had reason to, right? There hasn't been any reason for us to operationally use Tefenicline in any large measure, because we haven't really been at war, right? But if we were to have a large-scale sub-deployment of troops, like a brigade-sized element, a few thousand people in the U.S. Army going to Africa, I'm fairly convinced we would just use Malarum. Malarum was used for the Ebola deployment to Liberia by the U.S. Army, and I think maybe the U.S. Marine Corps, with great effect. We didn't see any problems at all from the drug. I don't think there was any malaria, maybe 4 suspect cases. I'm not sure if any of those were confirmed. So I think the military has realized it doesn't need to take the risk of using these drugs. There's nothing wrong with daily dosing. There's been a long-standing argument that troops can't be trusted to take a daily drug. That's nonsense. a third or more of our troops are taking multiple daily medications, whether for diabetes, hypertension, any number of mental health problems. It's completely normal and normative for troops to pick up every day and take all their pills. So there's nothing inherently abnormal or unreliable or dangerous about it. Counting on our troops to take a daily Malarone pill. And also Malarone is inherently forgiving of missed doses. You can now don't do this is not medical advice, but those of us in the field know very well that if someone is taking Malarone for malaria prevention, and they are in a highly endemic area and getting bit with malaria infected mosquitoes on a daily basis, you can actually miss a day or two or more of your Malarone if you just dose the missing doses when you remember. So it's inherently forgiving of missed doses for a number of reasons, because the drug actually kills malaria parasites in the liver before they get to the liver. So it's an inherently forgiving drug of missed dosing. It's perfect for military use, in my opinion, much better than doxycycline. Well, there's really no reason not to also give doxycycline to troops for a variety of reasons. So between the availability of doxycycline and the availability of Malarone, there's just no reason to give these drugs for prophylaxis. Now, there is the question of whether we need to give Remington or tafenoquine at home for something called presumptive anti-relapse therapy. But that's another discussion, and I don't see the need for tafenoquine in that context. Remington has been doing the job quite well for many years. So what's the future of tafenoquine? Hopefully, 20, 30 years from now, I won't be speaking to an auditorium or a Legion Hall full of tafenoquine survivors. I'm confident that's not going to happen. I think they learned from our experience. Finally.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Thanks, Dan. I don't know this myself, so maybe you would be able to help me. When it comes to using this drug for malaria, is it given in deployments where malaria possibilities are very low? Like, I just think desert. Why is it being given in those theaters?
Are you referring to Mefloquine or tafenoquine or just any
Anti-malaria drugs.
So it's a good question. So I wrote a chapter in a military textbook not long ago where I said, look, we have a problem, and don't take this wrong. It's not a problem. We have 20%-ish of the U.S. military now comprised of women. I'm not saying that's a problem, but we have a problem in that historically our anti-malarial drug development and utilization policies have just assumed that we're only giving anti-malarials to men. It never occurred to my colleagues in the malaria drug development community that we might one day be deploying large proportions of our force who are women and who are known to get pregnant on deployment. When I was in Afghanistan, we sent many dozens of women home who were pregnant. And all of them got non-judicial punishment. They all got punished because they had sex overseas and they're not supposed to have. And I remember asking my boss, I said, now we are punishing the men too, right? Because presumably, no. So that's another thing. So things have changed now because when we deploy large numbers of troops to malaria endemic areas, we have to accept the possibility that those troops can become pregnant, and that they can become pregnant while we are attempting to prevent malaria in them. And pregnancy, the diagnosis of pregnancy while deployed, for obvious reasons, including that women don't like being punished for being pregnant, is often delayed by many weeks to months. So we know as a military medical community that if we prescribe anti-malarials to troops in malaria endemic areas, we will be exposing lots of fetuses to anti-malarials. We accept this, we know this, or at least those of my colleagues who are responsible understand this. Which means we have to start thinking, well, should we change our policies to minimize field risk? And I have argued, yes, we should. So I don't think a one-size-fits-all anti-malarial policy is justified or ethical anymore. I think we need to treat, now this is going to come as a shock, I think we need to treat every soldier as a unique patient. and come up with a plan to prevent malaria in that soldier that is appropriate to their particular preferences and circumstances. I know that's shocking because that is otherwise known as the standard of care.
So not a garbage bag?
Not Doc reach into the garbage bag and pull out the box with somebody else in it. No, I think we have to stop doing that. We should never have done it, but I think now we have to stop doing that. Another benefit of women deployed to combat services is that maybe it'll finally shock the military into doing the right thing. So for some troops, actually, no anti-malarial might be the best choice. There are ways of preventing malaria that don't involve daily or weekly use of anti-malarial drugs. Believe it or not, there are ways to not get malaria that don't involve use of anti-malarial drugs on a regular basis. There are numerous strategies. Bite avoidance, right? If the threat is low, like in a desert area that you were alluding to, where there might be malaria, that's more of a theoretical risk, then you might just say, well, here's some bug spray and roll your sleeves down and treat your uniform with permethrin. I was thinking pyrethroid insect repellent. It's permethrin. Or you could just stay inside, right? With the bugs are. For when I was in Afghanistan, I was a father living in my air-conditioned tube. That was a perfectly appropriate option for me. I could just go to the chow hall and eat ice cream with mosquitoes. So every soldier, sailor, airman, marine has options. There are some environments where you'll probably want to recommend an appropriate anti-malarial be used all the time. But even then, depending on the circumstance, there's some flexibility. You might say, well, we might want most troops to take this drug, but maybe women can take this drug instead. So I'd like to think that the days of a one-size-fits-all anti-malarial policy are over. That we will prescribe anti-malarials as one of a number of possible preventive measures for future deployments. But we'll see. Who knows? I mean, within our lifetime, if Africa continues to industrialize and if standard of living continues to rise around the world, the Chinese and their economic development might do more to eliminate malaria than all of our work in tropical medicine. Because just like here in North America, when you get electricity and you get fans and you get air conditioning, the malaria just goes away, right? Because people start hanging out inside at school, and the malaria just goes away. So this might not even be much of a consideration in the next 20, 30 years. But until then, for short notice deployments, I'd like to think the days of our relying on only anti-malarials is premature.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying is typical for the military to kill a fly with a needle. A lot of guys complain religiously drug interactions from drugs used to treat PTSD as opposed to treating the core problem, which is a brainstem injury. What is our best approach? Most importantly, a lot of guys are frustrated. They can't talk to the doctors don't listen, they don't have knowledge, they don't believe them. What's our best options for treatment, for having conversations, going forward, how do we get people to hear us and those problems instead of just, thank you for your service.
All right, well, so I need to caveat what I say by a few cautions here. So I can't give medical advice. This is not medical advice. And also, unfortunately, there just hasn't been any proper studies done. At some point in the future, I'm very confident, and this will happen when some official at the VA or some official at the DoD or maybe some government official says, you know what, we have a problem. We poisoned a generation of our soldiers, and they have been left with permanent injuries as a result of an encephalopathic neurotoxic process from this drug. That day will come. And as soon as that announcement is made, the scientists will be lining up outside of their local granting agency with all sorts of proposals to study this and come up with treatments and so on. But scientists unfortunately are limited to doing work that government agencies support. Right? I learned this from my time at Hopkins, that you really can't be an independent scientist. Every single scientist in North America works for the government, with very few exceptions. And the reason they directly work for the government is because they need to apply for funding from the National Institutes of Health in the States, or whatever your equivalent is here. And as we've learned in recent years, those are highly politically connected organizations, and they will not take lightly to organizations advocating positions that go against the official narrative. So until you're not going to get an NIH grant with recent events, as an example. You're not going to get an NIH grant that would allow you to be critical of recent decisions made by the NIH or CDC, for example. And likewise with Nevin, right? They will say, oh, well, we don't think this has scientific merit. Whereas in actual fact, it's because they don't want to fund you. Right? So there's not going to be any real research done in this field until there's formal acknowledgement. And that acknowledgement will come in due course. And then there'll be lots and lots of work done. Okay, I say all this because what I'm about to say is not, there isn't good high quality evidence in support of this. In order for us to know what treatments will work, we first have to have agreement on what the condition is, and then we have to subject people with the condition to a randomized control trial where half get the drug that we think might help, and then half get a control group like a placebo, and we see if people actually get better, and we see if they develop new side effects from that treatment. We haven't done anything. So the state of knowledge that we have about what might work or what might not work is entirely based on anecdote. And people will often say, well, the plural of anecdote is not data, but that's not always true. If you accumulate sufficient anecdote in a reasonable manner, you can explore certain hypotheses and theories, and particularly if you have some insight into the mechanism, you can propose some starting points for future research. So here's what I'll propose. So we know that drugs of this class cause seizure. Right? This was one of the first side effects or adverse effects that was known with use of this drug. Seizure. Okay, so seizures and various types of seizures. Right? Grand mal seizures, petit mal seizures, absence seizures, lots of different kinds of seizures. Seizures often are the result of a particular foci injury somewhere in the brain, right? Sort of like a spark, if you will. Right? The wires are sort of sheared and sparks coming out, and that's where the seizure comes from. And it may very well be the case, in the same way that we know drugs of this class cause actual injury, actual neurotoxic injury in various areas of the limbic system, hippocampus, and brainstem. It could be, we don't know this for sure, but it could be that those areas might serve as a focus for seizure activity. And that in some cases, the waves of anger that wash over people, the waves of sort of psychotic-like symptoms that wash over some people, maybe every few days or every few weeks, or maybe the weather changes and those moves off a little more. It could be that those waves of symptoms in Mefloquine survivors are actually a manifestation of seizure activity, temporal lobe type activity. Temporal lobe seizures have a lot of symptoms in common with what many Mefloquine veterans report. So if that's the case, and if that is the case, and I think it's a reasonable hypothesis, or a reasonable theory to explore, then presumably anti-seizure medication might be explored as one option. Now, many people obviously are very wary of anti-epileptic seizure drugs. Some of those drugs are also prescribed for symptoms of bipolar disorder. So many Mefloquine veterans will find themselves on those drugs because a psychiatrist was experimenting with various drugs. It seems like a reasonable choice to make. Perhaps that may work in some people. It's a reasonable option to pursue. I advise psychiatrists who are consulting with me. But things that veterans can do on their own, I've heard from a number of families, a number of veterans, that adopting certain diets can be therapeutic. And this is actually not surprising, because one of the early treatments for pediatric seizures was ketosis. It was basically a full-on Atkins diet, ketogenic diet. And the thinking is that a ketogenic diet and essentially bathing the brain in ketones lowers seizure threshold, makes the brain less excitable. So perhaps, even if it doesn't undo the damage, it might make individuals less prone to these sort of episodic waves of symptoms that some people experience. I can't recommend that, right? This is not medical advice, but I've heard an uncanny number of people tell me that when they were eating a lot of carbs, eating sugar, their moods were terrible, and when they got on ketone or ketosis diet for weight loss, that they noticed their symptoms improved. I personally think ketosis is great. I think ketosis is a miracle for weight loss, and I think it can help people just have more mental focus throughout the day, because they're not always thinking about cookies, carbs. And are there any harms potentially associated with it? Probably not. So with the guidance of the physician, that may very well prove to be something appropriate to try. And I do suspect that when we finally do these studies, that or something similar, something that focuses on the seizure-like manifestation of the condition, will probably prove to be a major part of therapy. But beyond that, I can really only speculate, because unfortunately we still really don't understand what exactly the drug is doing on a molecular basis. We sort of do, right? Like it's neurotoxic, so some brain cells are killed in some people. And if it's not the neurons, maybe it's the glial, just the supporting structure. But which cells and what those cells are doing precisely that make them susceptible, and why some parts of the brain are affected, and why some parts aren't, I still don't have a good idea. I'm hoping someone smarter than me will look into this and can figure this out in due course. But with any disorder, when the medical community is first exploring and experimenting and trying different drugs, it always helps to not just have a shot in the dark. It always helps to have some idea of the basic pathophysiology, to have some understanding of what's biologically going on. And I think with our model of quinism or chronic encephalopathy as either chronic inflammation or a chronic dysfunction or an actual anatomical injury to microscopic areas of the central nervous system, I think that will help guide future therapies.
Before I open it up to questions, general questions and stuff, do's and don'ts for advocates in order to help move research forward and get funding. How do we support you? What don't we do? What can we do?
Well, I would say, it's our turn now. We've been sort of patiently waiting, especially down in the States, where there's been, a large amount of attention focused on things like burn pits and Agent Orange in the past. And we've been sort of patiently waiting our turn. Finally, we can say that the World War II era, Korea era, atomic veterans, I think all of their concerns are pretty much addressed. We finally checked that one off. I think Vietnam era vets down in the States, we were waiting on the blue water veterans, the folks that were exposed to Agent Orange on the ships. They finally had their concerns addressed. We finally got hypertension and a few other conditions acknowledged as presumptively service connected. And then the post 9/11 and the Gulf War era veterans, I think, have got most of their burn pit issues and toxic exposure issues, other than Mefloquine, addressed. So now it's our turn, right? And I think that's just the message. I think it's our turn, right? And the reason, I think it's important to point out the reason that the full magnitude of this problem hasn't been apparent, right? Agent Orange, it's obvious. You've got all this hypertension, all this diabetes, all this cancer. It's pretty obvious something's going on. Gulf War illness, they come back, completely novel disorder, it's pretty obvious something's going on. With Mefloquine poisoning, with chronic quinine encephalopathy, it's an hidden epidemic. Right? The problem with our constituency has always been that it's so easy to say, well, this is just PTSD, this is just traumatic brain injury. And so I think we have to make clear that there is more to these wars of the last 20, 30 years than just PTSD and TBI. It's this third signature injury that has been confounded by those two things. And it deserves attention. The strategy that my group has been focusing on is to take full advantage of and exploit, for good effect, the very generous, decentralized nature of the U.S. Veterans Disability Compensation System. So individual U.S. veterans can file a claim with the VA and submit medical evidence and through the process argue that their psychiatric disorder and typically they will, ideally they will have sort of an undifferentiated or non-specific anxiety condition. That's good enough, right? Because that's pretty much what mefloquine poisoning is, right? It's sort of undifferentiated, currently unspecified, not well described anxiety or depressive disorder. That might be a significant manifestation of the problem. So they claim that. They claim the anxiety disorder, but they specifically, in their claim, say due to mefloquine poisoning. And they get the VA to acknowledge that this anxiety disorder is the result of mefloquine poisoning. If we can get, and we have a lot, and I've been very busy this past 4 years. I know I've been quiet, but I have reasons for that. But we have many U.S. mefloquine veterans. They can fill this room easily. And in due course, at some point, there's going to be some sort of congressional hearing, and the room is going to be full of veterans who are going to hold up their VA rated decision letter that says they have a psychiatric condition due to mefloquine poisoning. That is when the government will need to act, because at that point, I think it will be clear that they have a problem. So that is the strategy that I would encourage everyone to pursue. Right? It's tempting if you can get disability benefits by saying it's PTSD. I can understand why you want to say that. But when a mefloquine veteran whose symptoms very clearly began before they experienced combat trauma, right? You were getting on the plane and you started to have nightmares of disaboweling your pet and eating its entrails. That's just it. And you've been haunted by that same nightmare ever since. And you wake up in a sweat because in your dream you're enjoying it. This is one example of a dream I've heard. And in some dreams, it's not their pet, it's something else. So I hear these nightmares all the time. If you've had those nightmares from before you even got overseas, and then you're laboring under these awful nightmares while you're deployed, and then you happen to go on patrol, and you happen to kill a few people, and you happen to take some fire, and then you go back, and you're terrified because not what happened to you on patrol, but because of the awful dream you're in. And that's still what bothers you years later. And then you have all sorts of other psychiatric problems related to that. It's very tempting to just take the PTSD award and collect your couple $1,000 and not make a big deal of it. But we have to let the psychiatric community know that that is not PTSD, right? If you had a choice as a veteran, and sometimes it is. There are some occasions where it's more complicated. I'll readily concede that. But there are many cases where it's not. Where it's absolutely clear that it's not the combat incident you experienced. It's the mefloquine. If, as a veteran, you are more afraid of going to bed every night because you don't want to relive those awful nightmares that began before you even deployed, if you're more afraid of that than you are of going back into combat. If I gave you a choice and I said, all right, you have a choice. You can be free of your nightmares once and for all, but you have to go into combat and relive that awful thing in your psychiatrist blame all your problems. That's a choice taken. Or you can stay safe in your bed every night, but have those awful dreams that you've been having. What do you think most Mefloquine veterans do? They'll pick combat any day, twice on Sunday, right? So if that's the case, that's not PTSD. And I think we need the psychiatric community to appreciate this. And so, I understand it's difficult. You need to get your benefits, and Veterans Affairs Canada, what they're called, Veterans Affairs Canada, they don't want to hear that you're having nightmares or taking Mefloquine. They'll accept any benefits if you say, I shot some people and you feel terrible. I understand you'll get your benefits that way, but in order to really, they're admitted, they know what's going on. They know what's going on. Some of them know what's going on, and they're more than happy. You say, it's not Mefloquine. We didn't do anything wrong. We didn't break the law when we gave you that drug in 1982. We've done nothing wrong. It's just PTSD. There's nothing wrong with Mefloquine. They want that. They want you to say it's PTSD. They want you to claim those drugs. Right now, I understand here it's difficult, but in the States, I have talked with the veterans, and in many cases they decide, in some cases they even challenge their PTSD rating. They say, what, docs, I don't want the VA to keep blaming this on Mefloquine. I want the VA to acknowledge this is Mefloquine. And so they actually risk giving up their rating for the chance of having it re-characterized. I could never recommend that a veteran do that, but many veterans want it. And I can certainly appreciate why, because in many cases it's just having that acknowledgement and having it in their records and then being able to show their psychiatrist, you see, doc, I was telling you all along, this wasn't PTSD, this was Mefloquine. They show the psychiatrist that rating signal, and the entire clinical relationship changes because the psychiatrist realizes, okay, wait a second, you were just making this up. Someone else actually, says, yeah. So I think that's how we make progress. In challenging individual cases, where it's clear cut, where there is some TBI, where there is some PTSD and the effects of Mefloquine, probably not the best test case, but there are some cases where we can definitely show that mistakes have been made. I really think we need to focus on those cases going forward.
Hey, Stephanie, can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
So I was in Somalia, and I just came out and tried to ask for help in 2019. We got a honorable but further service back in 94, 95. I've given the advocacy letter they wrote with Lisa M. That Stephen gave me to my doctors on multiple levels, and either say they don't know enough about it to make a decision, or they don't even consider it. And I find that really disheartening. How they should at least be aware of it.
So in the States, veterans there have a saying. I don't know if it's the same up here, but the old saying is VA's mission is to delay, deny, and wait till they die. Right? Same up here. Yeah. So look, the VA down in the States, I think they budgeted something like $200 billion, $300 billion. $100 billion here, $100 billion there. I mean, soon you're talking more money, right? Down in the States, getting these recent burn pit presumptives, meaning if you develop a certain condition a few years after service, they'll just presume it was due to your deployed service. So now a bunch of U.S. veterans can claim asthma, sinusitis, rhinitis. They claim hypertension due to Agent Orange, and it's all automatic. And it's going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars. So I think, and the thing is, the science supporting that isn't today. It's no more conclusive than it was 10 years ago. They knew as much 10 years ago as they know today. But what they were doing was they were just dragging it out, right? They were delaying it as long as possible under the pretense of scientific uncertainty, claiming, well, the science hasn't been well developed enough, or the science is still unclear. We need to do more studies. That's a bunch of nonsense. It's nonsense. They know darn well. It's a game they play to drag the process out so that they can delay paying what the veterans rightfully deserve as long as possible. Because during that 5 or 10 year period where they're delaying payment, some veterans will pass away. Some veterans will give up on their claims. And so the total, and through inflation, the amount of benefits they pay out in future years will in real terms be less. So the veterans agencies want to delay this type of acknowledgement as long as possible. They absolutely know what's going on, at least some of them do, right? The people who are responsible for Canada's policy on this, I guarantee you, they've read everything that I've written. They've read everything that has been written on this, and they're reading all of that because they're preparing for the lawsuits, right? They're not just sitting on the beach relaxing, waiting for the day they land in court. They're preparing their case, and they're determining, how well is our position, going to stand up to scrutiny. And I'm sure during this process they realized they're in deep trouble. I'm sure of it, right? So in that case, the only logical strategy is to delay as long as possible, because this is what they do in every other single situation. It's the reason why we've just now seen the progress we've seen in the States on Agent Orange related problems. How many decades has it been since these veterans were exposed to issues? It's been decades, right? So at some point something will happen, right? Where they're forced to concede as part of some sort of settlement process or politically. Yeah, and I know this sounds sort of ridiculous to say this because we've been struggling with this issue for many decades, particularly Somali and Arab veterans. But we're sort of on track. Like this is sort of, it's around, the timing is about right. Like these things take many decades. It's never fast. And when I was young, I was much younger, much fitter, and I didn't have any gray hair. I was just like every day, let's get stuff done. Like I want to see action now. And I was very impatient, and I was just so angry that we weren't making any progress. And then, as you get older, you sort of realize that's not how the world works. And you can try making things happen quickly, but you're just going to tire yourself out. And it's sort of in the grand scheme of things, I think we're on track here to see major progress this decade. And I know that seems like a long time, but it's very similar to the time frame over which we acknowledge the harms from, for example, tobacco smoke, right? When you think about it, when did we know cigarettes caused cancer? We knew that in the 40s and 50s, right? And when were the tobacco supplements in the 90s? Right? And that's tobacco, right? Affecting many more times the number of people that this is affecting. So I think we're on track.
Just legal actions that's going on around the world, other than in Canada. What's the status of some of these cases that have been going forward?
Well, so go on. Yeah, well, I can. I can talk in general terms because it is in a lot of cases it's public knowledge, right? Cases on the docket and so on are public knowledge. I've been retaining a number of matters. Specific developments in those cases. I'm not at liberty to share a lot of details on. And admittedly, I've been very quiet these last few years, and there's a good reason for that. As you can probably imagine, these past few years have not been an ideal time to publicly state that you disagree with the CDC or to question the safety of drugs in a public forum, right? Do you understand? So I realized early on that I just needed to shut up for a few months because I didn't want to risk getting cancer, right? I didn't want to risk losing my medical license incidentally, for daring to question the CDC, or daring to state that not every drug the government says is safe is safe. My profession has never been subject to the level of wholesale censorship that it was subject to over the past few years. And that obviously set us back a little bit, but in actual fact, I think it's going to help us. Because I think that large swaths of the public are sort of waking up to the idea that not everything the government has been saying is necessarily true. Now not necessarily, maliciously, but I think a large portion of the public realizes, gee, those experts in the government, sometimes they make mistakes. And maybe they were well-intentioned all the time, but everyone makes mistakes. And I think that's actually beneficial for us. right? Because our whole argument rests on, well, in a way, I mean, in large part, the government did get it right because the FDA did put on the label, if you take this drug and you develop, anxiety, depression, restlessness, or confusion, these are more serious events, and you must stop taking the drug. I mean, they did say that, so they did sort of get it right all along, but they didn't put two and two together. They didn't sort of connect the dots. Arguably due to the malfeasance of specific parties, but that's not here nor there. I think actually this is good, right? What's happened in recent years. Okay, but I'm digressing. You asked me about the legal progress. So in recent years, I have, let's just say there is a battle of the experts unfolding right now, and there are a lot of competing ideas and theories being treated. So we're at the point, I think, where, as it should, the legal process is allowing for a full and robust scientific debate among those with sufficient qualifications to engage in this type of debate. In various jurisdictions, the legal process is permitting the type of robust questioning of facts and assumptions to take place. This is all taking place, outside of the literature, but it is taking place in a very fair form. And I think the results of this are being widely shared among all parties with interest in this. So, for example, if there's a robust scientific debate about the actual mechanisms of Mefloquine toxicity, that debate is taking place in jurisdiction K, let's say. I think that debate is filtering down to jurisdiction I, and jurisdiction C, and jurisdiction U, let's say. So I think all parties are learning the facts, and I think this is good. And of course, well, I'll leave this to the lawyers to confirm. But I would like to think, the best outcome is just a favorable settlement, where all parties sort of come to an agreement, and there's some sort of acknowledgement made. But like the tobacco court case, sometimes real public health advances occur in the courtrooms, right? There was still manufactured doubt. There were still scientists funded by the tobacco industry or loosely affiliated with the tobacco industry that were advancing manufactured doubt about the dangers of secondhand smoke and the dangers of tobacco smoke, claiming that it was some sort of confounding effect, right up until the day that the courts ruled in the plaintiff's favor, right? And so legal action on pharmaceutical torts or environmental torts can often be the catalyst for a new wave of scientific acknowledgement and advancement. And I'm very optimistic that we are close to that date, and that it'll be like dominoes falling. When there is success in one jurisdiction, I think that it will, even though it's not directly relevant to the other jurisdictions, I think it will have a significant effect in other jurisdictions. But likewise, I don't think failure in one jurisdiction will necessarily doom the other jurisdictions. I don't think that. Because perceived failure can be due to any number of technical, non-scientific reasons. If these legal cases ever come down to a battle over scientific facts, I have every confidence that the other side will either capitulate or be seen to not have a valid. I'm that confident about the state of the science, even with all the uncertainty.
Anyone else?
Yeah, question for you. Well, actually, it's a couple that are related. So, I 2010, I was diagnosed with sleep apnea. I have obstructive and central. The nurse didn't know how I actually functioned on less than 3 hours sleep a night, but hey, whatever. I recently also, a couple years ago, I volunteered as part of a micro-traumatic brain injury study, and I got brain scans done. They say I'm normal. I think they forgot the AB in front of that. So my question for you is, the damage that potentially happens in the brainstem, is it visible to brain injury? And if it, or is there a threshold where all of a sudden, bang, it's there, or below that you can't see it?
Yeah, so, and you know, if it really is, it's one of these it's a sort of unfortunate scientific accidents, really, because there's really no reason why it shouldn't be visible. I guess it's just the nature of the injury. So what you should understand is that drugs of this class, drugs of the Quinism class, were extensively studied by, it's actually remarkable. It's a remarkable story. There's a pharmacologist named Leon Herbert Schmidt, and he was affiliated with a facility in Ohio, and he was recruited to the military's drug development program in World War II. And has anyone seen Oppenheimer?
Yes.
So while Oppenheimer was going on, while the Manhattan Project was going on, there was a mini Manhattan Project also going on that involved arguably a similar number of scientists that were, including Leon Herbert Schmidt, who were engaged in a struggle to find effective antimalarial drugs. And they were testing thousands upon thousands of compounds. And Leon Herbert Schmidt's job was to do some animal testing for toxicity. And he just happened to be married to this wonderful woman, Ida Schmidt, who happened to be, just by pure happenstance, and thank God she was a histopathologist. So, pretty girl in Ohio, and caught his eye, and they got married, thank goodness. Because what she did was she studied the brainstems of these test animals that Leon Herbert Schmidt's team was administering the antimalarial drugs to. And there were some of these monkeys and mice and dogs and rabbits that they were giving these quinoline test compounds to that had these funny neurological reactions, very obvious abnormal neurological reactions like stings, jerking of the eye and so on. And so she thought, I know what to do here. I'm going to look at their brainstems under the microscope. So she chopped up the brainstems of these monkeys and stuff and looked at them under the microscope. And in Leon Herbert Schmidt's words, it was a striking pattern of microscopic neuronal injury. It was unlike anything that had been described in the scientific literature up until this point. The brainstems of these animals were like microscopic Swiss cheese. He was much more erudite and elusive than I, much better vocabulary. And this started this many years long effort on her part, largely, and it was her, it wasn't him. She did the work. It was Ida Schmidt that did the work because she published independently in later years. But they tested hundreds of these compounds, quinoline compounds, and they found the same microscopic pattern of cell-specific neuronal injury affecting all parts of the central nervous system, primarily certain particular nuclei of the brainstem and certain areas of the limbic system. So basically the hippocampus, probably the amygdala, all the parts of the limbic system responsible for basic emotional and autonomic function, including the reticular activating system, which is responsible for sleep, and the hypoglossal nerve nucleus. And I remember when I first was noticing the large number of cases of obstructive sleep apnea among Mefloquine veterans, I thought, this doesn't make any sense. How does neurotoxicity cause a physical obstruction of the airway? And then it occurred to the tongue. So, has anyone ever heard of hypoglossal nerve stimulation? Do you know what that is? Okay, so hypoglossal nerve stimulation is a treatment for obstructive sleep apnea that basically is like a pacemaker for the tongue, basically, right? Like when you take a breath, the thing shocks your nerve, your hypoglossal nerve, and it basically tells your tongue to get out of the way. Because your tongue is this big, floppy, fat thing obstructing your airway. And unless it knows to get out of the way and you take a breath, you're going to have an obstruction. So that is my theory. And I may be wrong. I don't think I'm wrong. I'm wrong about a lot of things, but I don't think I'm wrong about this. And actually, this may very well be the way we make it real progress on this issue. This is just thinking about it. Because this is something that can be treated by a medical device company, right? And they can make money selling treatment for it. That's how you make progress. If you don't get a government grant, you make progress by getting the pharmaceutical companies or the drug device company involved. So anyway, my theory is that in cases of pure obstructive sleep apnea, when it's not just obesity, right? Obesity is by far the most common cause of sleep apnea. And if your doctor's giving you antipsychotic drugs or you're on certain antidepressants, and if you just feel terrible for obvious reasons and gain weight like me since you're in service, then even a few extra pounds can be enough to cause obstruction. But there are these sort of edge cases where you have a pretty fit, muscular guy or gal, and after Mefloquine, pretty much instantaneously they notice the onset of snoring or waking or gasping. And often it will be accompanied by other signs of neurologic dysfunction, like a vertigo or a disequilibrium. They may have nystagmus or visual disturbances. That suggests to me the possibility that there's multifocal brainstem involvement, including the hypoglossal nerve nucleus. And if the hypoglossal nerve nucleus is damaged, then I suppose it's plausible that the functioning of the hypoglossal nerve and the sort of rhythmic innervation of the tongue that's necessary to avoid obstruction will be disrupted. And you'll get obstructive sleep apnea as a manifestation of Mefloquine poisoning. And then the central apnea is much easier to explain. I've written about that. That's just any number of brainstem centers or limbic centers that are responsible for the breathing drive, the coordination of the breathing drive during sleep, including the RAS and other areas. If those are damaged by Mefloquine, that perfectly explains central sleep apnea. So either a central sleep apnea, obstructive sleep apnea, or a combination of the two can be plausibly explained by Mefloquine poisoning in some cases. Of course, there has to be the typical prodromal symptoms right here. You have to have evidence of symptomatic exposure. You can't have taken Mefloquine and totally fine, not had any symptoms, and then 10 years later develop sleep apnea and blame it on Mefloquine. That doesn't make any sense because you have to fit the picture. You have to have symptomatic exposure. You have to have psychiatric symptoms during use, which is an indication of personal susceptibility. You develop certain psychiatric and neurologic symptoms acutely during use that generally don't go away fully or that evolve in subsequent weeks to months to years. That is evidence of symptomatic exposure, of biologically relevant exposure to the drug. And in the event of that, in the event that you have that relevant symptomatic exposure, that really any neuropsychiatric symptom and certain physical symptoms like obstructive sleep apnea that you develop, they need to be evaluated in the context of a possible brain or brainstem etiology. And if that's plausible, that needs to be fully explored, and then the surgery needs to be done with other evidence of a brain or brainstem pathology. So in the event of someone having a suspected hypoglossal nerve or hypoglossal nuclei origin obstructive sleep apnea, they would need to be evaluated for evidence of dizziness, other vestibular symptoms. Essentially, the ENT doctor will look for evidence of vestibular involvement, essentially eye doctor, the neurotologist or neurooptometrist for evidence of visual system involvement, and then, of course, the full workup for previously undiagnosed psychiatric symptoms. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, in some regard, because I did have the nightmares. Like, I put Stephen King to shame, like some of the shit I would deal with at night. And I haven't had them in a long time, thankfully. And it was my first spouse who noticed that I'd be snoring before I could know it. And it didn't matter what time I went to bed, I'd wake up around 5. It felt like I'd been partying like a rock star, except there was no cocaine, there was no empty vodka bottles, there was no hookers. I would wake up every day. Not when you wake up every morning dead tired, there's nothing to give reason to it. And so, you know, I went to small unit, so we're looking, you know, almost a decade and a half later, when my apnea was recognized, or at least where I was at the point where it's like, yeah, I do have a sleep problem, and went and saw a sleep doctor, and then they put me on a CPAP, and everything's been great since. But I was just wondering, because I have heard a couple times that Mefloquine has a loose link to people with apnea. And so I'm wondering, because there's no one in my family had it, just me. So I'm wondering if that's one of the
I
missing
haven't
links.
forgotten you, Phil, so just hold still for a minute. On that note, we do notice patterns amongst ourselves when we talk and things that we have in common. And there is a difference between, perhaps side effects from prescription drug use and treatment for methadone itself. There are factors that where we age, and that where we maybe have more higher risk to develop certain things because of our lifestyles and that kind of stuff. And so, Doc, just quickly on that aspect of it to explain it.
Well, so we don't know fully. So this is very clearly, if this theory is correct, and I think it is. I haven't heard a better theory for these chronic effects. Assuming this theory is correct, that this represents a permanent neurotoxic injury to at least certain cells in the central nervous system, or the supporting adrenal network, which could basically mean the same thing. If that's the underlying pathophysiology, then this is correctly characterized as a neurodegenerative process because it involves degeneration of nervous tissue. So the neurodegenerative processes tend to worsen, at least slowly, over time, right? Like Alzheimer's is a prototypical neurodegenerative process. You don't really hear it getting better over time. It just sort of slowly gets worse. And a lot of neurodegenerative processes get worse. With other occupational neurotoxicoses as a model, lead encephalopathy, mercury encephalopathy, solvent encephalopathy, the general thinking is that after the initial insult is gone, that the nervous tissue is left somewhat more vulnerable, and that there will be sort of gradual worsening or expansion of the condition. But that being said, the brain is somewhat plastic, right? And people do report improvements, even in very obviously objectively physical abnormalities and the symptoms stemming therefrom, like the dizziness, right? So people who are very frankly dizzy and have very obvious disequilibrium after Mefloquine, this lasts like a year or so. So it's not a drug, it's not a direct drug effect, it's something physical happened to the brain center. People do report with therapy that there can be some fairly significant improvement, and that's probably because the healthy parts of the brain and brainstem are sort of picking up the slack, right? And because the brain is plastic, they're able to essentially fill in for the broken parts. But it's never going to work as well as it did before. And well, with that as an example, some Mefloquine veterans with frank vestibular dysfunction who do get a little better, they will report, like when the barometric pressure changes or when they have a cold or something, that they get really bad for a while. And I think it may very well be that they have like a secondary vestibular abnormality. They have like a transient peripheral vestibular abnormality, but now you got two hits, like two parts of your nervous system are damaged, and so now there's no fixing the underlying effect. So I think that with that as a model, I think that's sort of a reasonable that's a reasonable model for prognosis. That I think it's reasonable to expect after the acute illness. I think it's reasonable to expect some degree of asymptotic sort of plateauing towards a fairly stable level of
improvement. You're never cured. You're never as good as you were before. You're still significantly disabled in many cases, but you sort of learn to live with it. You learn to avoid triggers. And then, okay, with intermittent bouts of worsening, and then I think over time, just due to the fact that neurodegeneration is what it is, it's not unreasonable to think that will get worse over time, right? That these bouts might become more frequent, or that the baseline level of disability will increase. Unfortunately, Somalia-era veterans are really the canary in the coal mine for this, right? Because how long has it been?
30 years.
30 years. 30 years, yeah. So that, and many Somalia-era veterans were in their healthy 20s, right, when they started. So they'll be 50s now, and some, maybe more senior folks will be approaching the 60s, right? So this is now is when we're going to really start to learn more about these effects. And of course, the real challenge will be to disentangle what is a causal effect from Mefloquine from what will be attributed by many other people to, well, he's getting older. We see this all the time. And it is possible to disentangle this. It will be possible to disentangle this. And hopefully there'll be widespread recognition that this is a problem, and we can start to do these types of studies.
Yeah, because that's exactly where my wife is terrified of, because you're going to sort of picking up, and this stuff seems to be exactly that. Bill?
This is pretty much where we're talking about exactly where I was thinking about Schmidt, and that describes my experience. A lot of them talk about the profile. That's my experience. I describe it as a roller coaster. All 96. I stick with 5 years. All that happened to me in short order. I was talking about 3 weeks. That's it, baby. And my measure is cancer knocks off. I had been pre-screened for 3 years. I had concussion from spinal injury. Previously, I had Tox-VET. I had sepsis. So I probably always been around. Besides the street, he was also going to follow up and usual. So I don't want to see that because it's not a policy. But I could have remembered using measures that didn't have a time. So they're completely for a lot of multiple people. Now, what I was saying to you, back to the step, any ologies was not my means back. It's actually resolving the brain. The way I explained it to my mom was exactly what you had said. The brain is system, but I was feeling certain pockets of the brain along with the system. What you described for T15 and I'm certain by other mind handles that otherwise the states. My question was, who's like your bed rate? That's where I'm at now in this progression is white matter disease. Okay, so I analogize it to computers and computer function. It's pretty good analogy. This is if your core CPU function, your operating system. So that's why that area, the heart rate will be increased. Train control your body temperature, small body of body, 30 seconds. And some people that do that, like a family attack, I'm really quite a lot. Anyway, point this, I'm not enough horrific deaths in cases of accidents, atrocious, forensic scenario. Somebody that's going to be brought to bring to look at the first one to do that, like the carbon monoxide hiding with it.
Well, yeah, I've received many emails over the years So I have looked at that if a Mefloquine veteran were to pass away was an incidental reason, and over the course of an autopsy conducted for other reasons, right? Let's say they had a heart problem, and the pathologist was just very, very particular and very detail oriented and did a head-to-toe neurohistopathological study, but they might incidentally come across some abnormalities in brainstems, brains of a Mefloquine veteran, and they might have the wherewithal to maybe look it up and maybe put two and two together, but that is so unlikely. That's not going to happen because autopsies are very rare, and typically when autopsies are done, there isn't that type of very detailed neurohistopathological study done. It's certainly not at the level. So Ida Schmidt, when she did this, you have to understand this is a different era. When I read these documents from the World War II era, I think this is like some ancient great civilization that I just don't recognize. These people were incredible. The attention to detail and their discipline and their commitment to the scientific process is unlike anything that our modern era can muster. It really is remarkable that we have this data to begin with. That she paid such exquisite attention. So she very likely saw these very abnormal clinical findings and then knew exactly what to look for. And then dissected just the right parts of the animal's brains to look for it. And then her and her husband had the knowledge to expand upon that. You're not going to see that with your typical hospital pathologist. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And so the type of study that you're describing, like what if we could just all donate our brains to science, and then, as we pass away, for various sundry reasons, naturally not encouraging, because the danger with this line of thinking, and I think we need to acknowledge it, is that some veterans might think, I'm going to help the cause, and I don't want anyone to think that is a good idea for obvious reasons. So there is a danger to planning for this type of thing, if you can appreciate what I'm saying. But let's suppose we were to conceive of this kind of study, right, where veterans could sign up to donate their bodies to science, right? You have to understand what a massive undertaking this would be. This would be very, very costly because you would need to enroll sufficient numbers of veterans that you would expect, a handful of natural deaths every year. But then you would have to enroll a set of, you have to enroll a nationwide system of pathology labs, right? And they would have to be on call 24/7 to attend to a death when it occurs. If a future government properly acknowledges this problem and fully commits to do everything right to fully understand and study this, if they want to donate, if they want to commit $100 million-ish in 10 years, and possibly more, then you might be able to do a fairly good job of studying this nation. I have argued instead of doing this, that we could just do what they did in World War II. And I know we all love monkeys, and I know we all, animal testing is bad. I understand it. But if we don't test drugs on animals, we test them on ourselves. Right? So if we were to simply require animal model testing of this class, in particular, if we were to repeat some of the experiments that Dr. Dow did with Mefloquine being given to rats and mice, but we were to repeat those same experiments using certain primate models, if we were to sacrifice a few dozen or a few hundred monkeys, I know that sounds terrible. I'm fairly certain we would get to the bottom of this issue fairly quickly. And then that similar injury in humans would be conceded on that basis, and we wouldn't need to prove it because in general, although there's quite a range of response to this drug, to these drugs, depending on the animal model. If you see it in monkeys, there's a very good chance you're going to see it in humans. So rather than push for a large-scale human post-mortem study, just if you can convince the PETA folks to just let us have a few hundred monkeys, I think we could probably demonstrate this effect.
PETA is the biggest live kill organization in the world.
Oh, right, yeah, with shelters and things.
Yeah.
With the same discussion we were having now, Chris Nowinski, they call him the brain doctor or something like that, he's doing all the testing for CTE for the NFL people and the WWF people. I know some NHL people. So the system that they have is a bit smaller than what you're talking about now. And I heard that the Royal Canadian Legion was doing a study that I found, and I was told that it was wrong. Could there not be a study done that was essentially like we would then sign up to donate our brains to this location and address on the day when we do kick the bucket?
Right. So yeah, you see how long it took them to arrange for this type of study among NFL players and so on. What was that movie that starred Will Smith? What was that movie?
Concussion.
Was it called Concussion? Yes. And those events took place when? They took place in yeah, see, so it's a long time. So we could absolutely, like I said, if some generous government wants to donate, or wants to fund something to the tune of probably $100 million-ish, probably do it. It's a little complicated, right? Because this is getting a little macabre here. You're talking about this, but
We are in the fall.
what's that?
We are in the fall.
Yeah, yes, yeah. You need to prospectively enroll a fairly large number of athletes. In the same way they probably prospectively enroll a large number of sports players. There need to be some sort of network set up across the country to facilitate the actual logistics of what we're describing, because you need to do the testing very quickly. And so there's a large base of logistics support that has to be basically on call 24/7. That's basically just twiddling their thumbs until they get the call. It's very expensive and it seems really wasteful, right? Unless there's really large-scale support for something like this. But assuming that there's widespread awareness of this, and that at the hospital where the declaration is made, if they see the card, on the veteran, they immediately call the coordinator immediately springs in action, and they get the jet ready, and they do everything right. Maybe in as little as a year from the day you actually start the study, you can actually see some early results, kind of like what they saw early on with CTE. But I think the studies that have been done of CTE, I don't know how much they spent, but it's not an insignificant sum. It's I think a fairly extraordinary commitment that's being made, and I can see there being some reluctance to spend money on that particular type of study early on in this process. Like this whole process is huge, that some large organization, preferably a government, acknowledges there's a problem that's worth studying. I think that and that's a big ask right now. But assuming that's forthcoming, I would think there would be other studies that could be done earlier on that would bring more useful information earlier. So in the same way that it took 3-4 decades for the CTE community to finally be at a stage where now they can do this. I don't really think there's much doubt in the community at all that CTE is a real thing that's associated with traumatic injuries. But that's 5 decades in the making, right? From the time that one doctor had the idea that CTE is a thing to the point where you have this study in place where now it's CTE, see it on autopsy all the time. 4 or 5 decades. So I would think that, yeah, in due course we might see that, right? Like, but if there was a big pot of money made available to do method study, I can think of better ways to solve the money. Go ahead.
I just wanted to follow that up. So we're talking about what I should call conventional, digital, a lot of scientific studies where you study about revolution in technologies and brain science and understanding. A lot of it's coming out of this stuff with computer interface companies. Meeting with Europe now bringing these labs. Knowledge on the people, the possibilities are top down. We should create these supervised networks. Past the surface. Anyway, the other side of the
Well, wouldn't it be great if we get Elon Musk? It wouldn't be great if we get his ear, because we could probably get this thing solved right away. There's two things. So two developments that might actually turbocharge this field. The first is, I think, large scale genomics testing, large scale genetic testing. I've long thought if I could just get the ear of someone at 23andMe, you know that company where they have that in Canada, 23andMe.
Yeah.
So if I could just get the ear of someone at 23andMe, and just get them to do a quick study, you know how you get on your app, sometimes they ask you to do research, right? If they could just do a quick survey, hey, have you ever taken Mefloquine? Did you ever have nightmares from Mefloquine? Just like two simple questions. Have you taken Mefloquine? Did you have symptomatic exposure? And they just ran a very quick whole genome scan to look for positive hits. I bet you that they would find something. Because my long-standing theory has been, I mentioned there that Mefloquine veterans who suffer this problem, for some reason they're susceptible to methadone. Some people aren't. If you give enough methadone to anyone, you will see these effects, right? But the issue with methadone poisoning for most veterans is that at the relatively low, and it's not low. You mentioned you had these problems after 3 tablets. 3 tablets of methadone is 750 milligrams, which is almost a gram. You can feel that in your hand. That's a lot of methadone. Like 750 milligrams of methadone is a lot of methadone. And if that accumulates preferentially in the brain, as we know it does, that's a lot of methadone in your brain. And given how relatively small your brain is, that is a very high concentration of methadone. So it is a lot of methadone. But my point is, in all this, is that even if you give a lot of methadone to someone, if it doesn't get in the brain, if it doesn't concentrate in the brain, then it's not a lot of methadone. It can't exert its neurotoxic effects. So what predicts that? What is it that predicts whether methadone will accumulate in the brain? Methadone or a metabolite that we might not have identified. The toxic version of methadone, because methadone itself or toxic metabolite, what predicts that concentrating to abnormally high levels in some people and not others? Or I should say, I should use the word abnormal. I should say, what predicts that concentrating to relatively high levels in some people and not in others, to toxic levels in some people and not in others? And the simplest theory is that there's some simple drug transport, that there's some simple protein, some simple enzyme that is a constituent of the blood-brain barrier, maybe more in some places than others. And it's just a simple polymorphism or mutation or variant that some people have and some people don't have that entirely predicts this effect, or that predicts 90% of the effect. And maybe there's some environmental exposures, like some chemicals that might predispose people to this, that genetically that they would normally be protected, but maybe there's some environmental contaminant. Some people have told me musks might serve that purpose, or opioids or some other drugs that might accentuate the drug's accumulation rate. But regardless, if we assume that it's mostly a genetically defined trait, then they should be able to, with a couple of keystrokes, honestly, like with no more than 15 minutes of work on their part, once they get the survey data, they might be able to isolate a number of gene candidates that would point to specific enzymes and that would really tie this thing together. So that's a possibility that basically a very simple, almost hobby type scientific study that someone does in their spare time could shed huge light on this question. That's one possibility. The other possibility, I think, is advanced neuroimaging. I was sort of hoping that's room temperature superconducting candidate that people have reported earlier this year. You guys know about LP99 or whatever it is? Some room temperature superconductor. I was sort of hoping that would pan out, because if we could produce super high field strength MRI machines, like not these piddly little 5 Tesla or 7 Tesla MRIs, I'm talking like 100 Tesla MRI. If we could produce like a super high field strength MRI that would have sub-millimeter resolution, that would have like micron level resolution, then you could probably see this damage through imaging. And maybe with AI or something would find some way to improve upon conventional neuroimaging. I don't know. I mean, you know those old CSI shows where there's like this pixelated picture and they enhance and somehow like there's all this detail. And when I was a kid, I thought you can't create detail from pixels, but apparently with AI you can. So who knows? Maybe there's a way to use AI to enhance the resolution of even conventional MRI scans. I don't know. We'll see. But either a combination of AI or high field strength magnets might actually enable us to see this type of injuries. And so if we had even a couple cases with the proper history, right, symptomatic exposure, typical psychiatric symptoms, the development of objective abnormalities in the vestibular system, like definite nystagmus, definite abnormal saccades, definite abnormalities in VNG or ENG or a rotatory chair, like objective evidence of a central dysfunction. And if we had imaging evidence that showed this in sub-millimeter micron level evidence of injury in the vestibular nuclei, that would be a slam dunk. Everyone who's a defendant in any medical suit would immediately get their checkbooks out and say, I can help you win. Like that would be better evidence of pathophysiology than we have for many diseases. And we're almost there, right? We have everything, but we just don't have the histopathological evidence. But we have very strong correlates of that with the objective findings. We really don't have any other logical explanation but for that type of cellular injury.
Stefan.
So we're right back to square one, which is funding versus acknowledgement. And if we don't have a government that's going to acknowledge the problem, we'll never get the funding for it.
Well, so it would be nuts. It would obviously be very nice if one day I'm reading, Military Times, and there's a story about how the military had a press conference and they acknowledged that, oops, we goofed and Mefloquine is toxic and we poisoned the generation. That would be nice because the funding would immediately flow from that. But we can, even without that, we can make progress. So a combination of case reports, continued disability claims, and slow growing interest among previously unaffiliated scientists who are sort of pursuing this issue independently without formal funding. It can happen organically. I mean, the fact that I'm here talking about this, and I'm a scientist, it does show that this is possible. You can't get slow scientific advances even without some sort of formal acknowledgement. But it would become so automated so fast if there were that acknowledgement. Absent some sort of formal acknowledgement, it will remain a little bit of a struggle, right? But once that acknowledgement does come, it'll really be like a floodgates. It would just, it'll knock your socks off how many scientists all of a sudden are experts in method. And they're all, talking about method and this and method and that, to conferences. They'll
Keep looking for that data out.
it will. I guarantee it. There'll be like fancy shrimp cocktail buffets and stuff. All scientists standing around making small talk, and because it's what happened with PTSD, right? In the 70s, you couldn't get your psychiatrist to acknowledge anything, right? Until the VA and the DOD and the American Psychiatric Association acknowledged it, and then gradually you started to see people make their careers studying PTSD, right? I'll tell you a funny story. So actually, I was married before, and my ex-wife, she got a job actually working for the Center for the Study of Post-Traumatic Stress. This was right before 9/11, and they had some funding, but there wasn't really a major war going on until that time, and so they sort of fall on hard times. We went to work in this drafty old corner of the building. There were like mouse traps all over the place. They had no money, and they were struggling to study PTSD. And then, sure enough, 9/11 hit, and we started deploying people, and the money just gushed in. And the poor fellow that was heading that center, like just a threadbare staff, could barely summon a few dozen researchers to their annual conference. And a few years later, they're in charge of $500 million or some similar amount of funding. And it may very well happen with Mefloquine. I mean, I have a lot of colleagues that are always on the hunt for the next big thing. And if it's ever understood by the scientific community that there's hundreds of millions of dollars in funding available to study Mefloquine, guarantee people will come out of the woodwork, and there'll be whole journals dedicated. It's just like there's whole journals today dedicated to PTSD and TBI, whereas 20 years ago,
So a couple of years ago, I was part of a study at Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto, PTSD and TBIs, using the MRI machine, the MEG machine, and I had a bunch of questionnaires, and I put Mefloquine down, and it was funded by DND, and but I don't think they took the Mefloquine stuff at all seriously.
Actually, they did. So I did the same study and had several conversations with the intake. And one of the things I've done was I asked, I told them I was hesitant to be a part of the study because I thought I might have a confounder, right? Because I had taken Mefloquine, right? But I did have a PTSD diagnosis. And interestingly enough, they were actually doing this study for, I believe, Veterans Affairs. And so it was, however, a generalized PTSD study. It was open to the military and non-military. But because of those questions, I got a phone call back from them and it said, you had some really good stimulation, good conversations here over your question. And what we've decided to do is to create a subclass so that we will have PTSD, civilian PTSD, military. So if we see anything that comes up, we can, make a differential to it. So they did in that respect.
I should just use this opportunity to emphasize something. So, as I alluded to earlier, the reason we're in this pickle we're in right now is because of what I believe was an intentional, deliberate campaign to manufacture doubt and sully the scientific literature. And unfortunately, if we're not careful, the interests who are not aligned with us will try to pull another fast one. And they are trying. And people that know better, that should know better, are somewhat shamelessly engaging in this. And I'll just give as an example that National Academy study that was recently done. As you all know, a very limited number of studies have been done looking at longitudinal outcomes among folks who've taken Mefloquine. But the danger in our asking for more of these studies, or the danger in our saying, you need to study Mefloquine, is we have to be very careful what it is we're asking them to study. So our concern is not what are the health outcomes among veterans who took Mefloquine. that is not the outcome we are interested in. Because we all know that many of our fellow soldiers, our fellow service members, took Mefloquine, and I know if you're in Somalia, you don't believe this, but there are some service members that took Mefloquine and really didn't have any problems. Right? Let's just for argument's sake assume that 2/3 of people that take Mefloquine don't have problems, right? And 1/3 of people that take Mefloquine do. So if we ask the government, if we ask Veterans Affairs to study health outcomes among veterans who took Mefloquine and compare those to health outcomes among people that didn't take Mefloquine, they're really not going to see much signal, because the effects that we're concerned about are going to be diluted by the normal health outcomes among people that took Mefloquine and didn't experience any of the prodromal symptoms during use. And this is my criticism of the National Academy study that was just done. Even though there were very distinguished, very intelligent people in charge of that committee, they completely dropped the ball. They completely missed the plot. And the people on this committee should know it, because many of them are experts in environmental and occupational epidemiology, and they understand the concept of biologically relevant exposure. Let's just pretend for a moment that this coffee cup is a pack of cigarettes, right? By their reasoning, I am being exposed to cigarettes. But just assume this is a pack of cigarettes, right? If I'm holding a pack of cigarettes my entire life, but I never actually smoke it, is it fair to do a study of lung cancer in people like me and conclude that because I didn't develop lung cancer being exposed to cigarettes, that cigarettes aren't dangerous? No. Because in order for cigarettes to be dangerous, you have to do what? You have to open the pack, you have to put it in your mouth, you have to light the cigarette, and you have to inhale, right? So there has to be biologically relevant exposure. So for veterans that took Mefloquine and took it for many weeks or months, and they never once developed any symptoms, from what we know of Mefloquine, are they at any risk of chronic disability on that basis? How many Mefloquine veterans complain of chronic disability but never had any problems during their use of the drug? I don't think there are any. Every single case report I've seen, every single veteran I've talked to that complains of chronic disability following their use of Mefloquine had what? They had symptomatic exposure. They had biologically relevant exposure. It's the equivalent of putting the cigarette in your mouth and lighting it. And what our adversaries are doing is very intentionally playing dumb. They're playing dumb. They're manufacturing doubt. They're saying, no, we've done plenty of studies. We've looked at veterans that took Mefloquine, and we don't see these veterans developing any. Well, yes, first of all, because they're studying the methods are lousy, right? So they're not very precise. So there's a lot of noise. And even if there was a signal there, you wouldn't see it, right? But the problem is they're intentionally diluting the signal by including these other veterans that don't have any biologically relevant exposure. What we need to study are the health outcomes among veterans that took Mefloquine and experienced the nightmares, the insomnia, the anxiety, the depression, the restlessness, and the confusion that the drug company itself said requires you to immediately discontinue the drug. Because if you don't discontinue the drug, what are you going to score? A more serious event. So those are the veterans who were exposed, veterans with symptomatic exposure. And no study that's ever been, with the exception of one study out of the Scandinavian region, no published study has looked at the outcomes among symptomatically exposed persons. So, when the National Academy concludes that, well, we studied the literature and we don't see the things, part of me thinks this is part of an intentional plan to further manufacture doubt and further delay recognition of these effects, because the people involved must know better. And if they don't, shame on them, right? That's just sloppy. Scientists make mistakes. We all make mistakes. But come on, to ignore the significance of prodromal symptoms. The whole reason we had the box warning was to emphasize the critical importance of this biologically relevant exposure. So careful what you ask for. We're not just interested in the studies of Mefloquine. We need to study outcomes among people with symptomatic exposure and compare those to people without symptomatic exposure. And I think the results of those studies are very different.
Thank you very much. For anyone who still has a question, what we're going to do is we're going to stop here, and you can just ask questions on your own. I really want to thank you, Doc. It's amazing to see you again. Thank you for coming back. And I want to give the last word back over to Marge.
So I hope you got something from this, and we're going to continue to have our conference. We used to call it a rally. We call it a conference now because you're starting to have the 2-day program, and hopefully continue having an educational day and then a gathering rally afterwards. So join us, please. It'll be good. Thank you again, Dr. Remington.